She was sharp as a whip. Susan Saran once cracked complex trading formulas in seconds, governed high-stake financial investigations, and walked through life with a clarity most dream of. And then one day, she forgot how to multiply 7 times 7. At just 57, Susan was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. It's not just memory loss. It's a slow, cruel unraveling of the self. But she wasn't going down without a plan. She drafted an advance directive for dementia, a controversial document that said clearly, if I reach a stage where I no longer engage with the world, please do not feed me artificially. But even that plan was denied, a diagnosis that changed everything. For most of her life, Susan Saran was the kind of woman others looked up to, sharp, independent, determined. Her world was made of numbers and negotiations, fast-paced decisions on the trading floor, and the quiet confidence of someone who always had her mind about her. She wasn't just smart, she was formidable. Then came the forgetting. It started small, a misplaced appointment, a delay in recalling names, but then the signs grew bolder, more aggressive. She began to lose focus during tasks she'd mastered for decades. Spreadsheets blurred into chaos. Words slipped out through her memory like sand between her fingers. It wasn't just aging. Susan knew that. Deep down, she knew something more insidious had taken root. The diagnosis was frontotemporal dementia, a brutal, progressive brain disease. There was no cure, no miracle therapy, just a ticking clock. She was 57. Everything fell apart in a matter of months. Her career, once the foundation of her identity, was gone. Her independence, pride, even her social life began to crumble. There was no time to adjust, to grieve slowly. Dementia doesn't grant that kindness. It came like a thief in the night, stealing everything that made her feel like herself. And yet, amidst the sorrow, Susan made a choice, one rooted in clarity. She would not be passive. She would not wait for the disease to define her end. If she could not control how long she had, she could at least control how it ended. She sold her home, said goodbye to the city that once moved to her rhythm, and she moved to Kendall at Ithaca, a retirement community nestled in the quiet, rolling hills of upstate New York. Its promise was simple: comprehensive health care for life. It felt safe. It felt final. Here, she thought, she could live the remainder of her years with dignity. She believed Kendall would honor the choices she would someday be unable to voice. She was wrong. In 2018, after enduring 2 brain hemorrhages, Susan drafted a specialized advance directive, a legal document outlining her wish not to be hand-fed or given fluids when her mind and presence faded beyond recognition. It was her way of holding on to autonomy, even as the disease took everything else. But what Susan didn't anticipate was that her fiercest battle wouldn't be with dementia. It would be with the very institution she entrusted with her care. The halls of Kendall were peaceful, the gardens serene, but behind those quiet walls, a storm was brewing. Her directive was met not with support, but with legal disclaimers and bureaucratic silence. They told her no, that state and federal laws required feeding, that her written wishes, her attempt at control, were not legally binding. And just like that, Susan's sense of peace began to unravel, not because of memory loss, but because she realized her voice might not matter, even when she'd spoken it so clearly, so early, so courageously. What is an advance directive, and why it matters? When Susan first heard about the concept of an advance directive, it felt abstract, something older people did when they had time to think about endings. But after her diagnosis, time shifted. The future wasn't something distant anymore. It was hurtling toward her with terrifying speed. She began researching, obsessively reading about end-of-life care, patient rights, and most importantly, how to maintain dignity when you could no longer speak for yourself. That's when she discovered the newer, lesser-known branch of advanced directives, dementia directives. Traditional advanced directives are often built for immediate, catastrophic scenarios, a coma, a persistent vegetative state, sudden trauma. They ask questions like, do you want to be kept alive on a ventilator, or should we attempt CPR if your heart stops? But dementia doesn't work like that. It doesn't come crashing down all at once. It erodes you, inch by inch. One day, you forget your address. Months later, you don't recognize your reflection. Eventually, you forget to swallow, to speak, to smile. And in that agonizing limbo, not alive in spirit, not gone in body, people like Susan can linger for years. The dementia directive changed everything for her. It was different. It allowed her to declare, in clear and specific terms, how she wanted to be treated when her cognition faded beyond return. Not just keep me comfortable, but things like, do not assist me with feeding. Do not offer hydration if I am no longer aware, or do not prolong my life through routine interventions. This wasn't about suicide. It wasn't about giving up. It was about sovereignty, the right to say I want to live as myself, not merely survive as a shell. For Susan, it was a revelation. She worked with a lawyer, reviewed every line with trembling hands, and then she signed it not in fear, but in strength, because she knew the version of herself who enjoyed books, who sat in meditation, who loved her cats and cooked her own meals. That version had a limit, and she wanted her final chapter to end with grace, not confusion, with intention, not accident. This kind of planning is still rare. Most Americans haven't even written a basic will, let alone considered how they'd want to be treated if they no longer recognized their children or forgot how to eat. But for the 14 million Americans projected to develop Alzheimer's by 2050, that silence will come, and with it, uncertainty. Susan didn't want her loved ones or strangers to guess. She put it in writing. She made it known. But as she would soon discover, writing it down was only the beginning. Making it matter, making it count, would be another fight entirely. Chasing dignity before it's gone. Susan had always believed in preparation. She wasn't the kind of person who left things to chance, not in her work, not in her relationships, and certainly not in how she would die. So, after signing her dementia directive, she felt a rare moment of peace. For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt something return, a sliver of control, a boundary drawn in a world that was slowly unraveling. The disease could take her memory, her speech, even her sense of time, but it would not take her dignity, not if she could help it. She printed copies, sent one to her lawyer, gave another to her doctors. She placed one in a folder marked Life, a folder she told a close friend to open if things ever got bad. She didn't want to leave a mess. She didn't want people guessing, agonizing, or disagreeing around a hospital bed. She wanted clarity. She wanted kindness. So when she handed the document to Kendall, the care facility where she had invested more than $500,000 for her future, she expected, if not comfort, then at least respect. But what she received was a form letter from their legal team, citing federal and state regulations. They told her that her wishes could not be honored, that they were obligated to provide daily meals and to assist with feeding, even if she no longer responded, even if her directive said otherwise. In one sentence, her carefully built plan was undone. The betrayal was not just bureaucratic, it was existential. Kendall had promised care for life, and Susan had interpreted that to mean care for her values, her agency, her personhood. Instead, she found herself trapped in a system that saw her future not as hers, but as theirs to manage, according to rules she had no say in. It shook her, not just because of what it meant for her own end, but for what it said about how we, as a society, treat those who lose their minds before their bodies. In every other area of life, consent matters, autonomy matters, but in the strange silence of late-stage dementia, all of that seemed to dissolve. Susan still had her sharpness, not in memory, but in clarity. She could cook. She drove to her Buddhist temple. She fed her cats, Squeaky, Sweetie, and Pirate. But now, every day, that folder marked Life sat a little heavier on the table, because what good is a voice written in ink if no one listens when you can no longer speak, in trying to escape the slow erasure of self that dementia promises? Susan found herself erased in another way by a system that refused to acknowledge the woman she still was and the woman she once chose to be. A $500,000 decision that backfired when Susan sold her home and signed the contract with Kendall at Ithaca. It felt like a conclusion, a final chapter opening with quiet meadows, structured care, and the promise of peace. She had poured her savings over $500,000 into securing not just a room, but a future, a safe harbor for the storms she knew were coming. The brochures spoke in soft, reassuring tones, comprehensive care for life. The staff were kind, the facilities immaculate. There were walking paths, book clubs, wellness programs, all designed to ease residents gently into the twilight of their years. Susan exhaled when she arrived. For the first time since her diagnosis, she allowed herself to feel relief. She believed she had done everything right, but money can't buy autonomy, not when the system itself doesn't recognize the currency of choice. When Kendall rejected her dementia directive, it was more than a denial of paper. It was a denial of identity, of investment, of trust. Susan had committed not just funds, but her entire future to this place, and now she realized that future was no longer hers to shape. They told her, we must offer food. They told her, feeding is comfort care. They told her, the law leaves us no choice. But Susan remembered clearly what it felt like to have a choice, and she knew what it meant to lose one. The letter didn't just upset her, it dismantled her sense of safety. The foundation of Kendall's promise had cracked, revealing something she hadn't expected, that even in a place built for aging, Dying was still something beyond her control. It felt like she'd been tricked, not out of her money, but out of her voice. For many, Kendall was a sanctuary. For Susan, it had become a paradox, a place that promised freedom, yet refused to honor the freedom she had claimed for herself. She began to question everything. Had she misunderstood their promise? Had she placed her faith in an illusion? Was the phrase comprehensive care just a euphemism for policies that prioritize risk avoidance over resident autonomy? There was no recourse, no appeal, no space for dialogue. The decision was made. She stayed, for now, because leaving meant losing everything she had invested. And yet, staying meant surrendering the very thing she had fought so hard to protect. Every morning, she walked the quiet halls of Kendall, smiled politely at staff, fed her cats, and every evening, she stared at the folder containing her directive, a document now stripped of power, a roadmap to dignity, leading nowhere. In the end, the cost of Kendall wasn't just financial. It was spiritual. It was personal. It was the silent price of realizing that a future you paid for might never belong to you. Feeding against her will, legal or ethical, there's a kind of violence that doesn't leave bruises. It's the quiet violence of being denied your voice, of being made invisible, not through malice, but through bureaucracy. And for Susan, that violence took the shape of a spoon. To the outside world, feeding someone seems like the ultimate act of compassion, a symbol of care, a gesture of love. But what happens when the person being fed has already said no? What happens when that gesture becomes a violation? Susan's directive was clear. She didn't want to be kept alive through hand feeding or artificial hydration if her mind had slipped beyond recognition. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a deeply spiritual one, born from years of reflection, Buddhist practice, and an unshakable belief that life without awareness was not life at all. But the laws, at least in New York, didn't care about nuance. In their eyes, feeding was comfort care, a basic human necessity that must be offered, regardless of prior wishes, even if that meant going against a resident's documented directive, even if it meant prolonging a body whose spirit had already quietly left. And so, Susan was trapped, not by disease, but by definitions. There is a bitter irony in this, that the same society that champions bodily autonomy in so many contexts becomes suddenly paternalistic when it comes to dying, that we trust people to make choices about chemotherapy, about ventilators, even about ending pregnancies. But when someone says, "Do not feed me if I no longer recognize myself," we hesitate, we label it controversial, we invoke protection over permission. Experts, too, are divided. Some, like Dr. James Wright, argue that patients with late-stage dementia can still express joy, that even a flicker of recognition, a smile, a grunt, an open mouth is enough to justify continued feeding. To him, withholding food is akin to starvation. But others, like hospice physician Dr. Carl Steinberg, see things differently. He believes in honoring the voice that was once strong, the person who made their wishes known while they could. Don't feed unless they ask, he says. And how could they ask, Susan wonders, if they no longer understand what they're being offered? This is the ethical maze Susan now lives in, where every path seems lined with good intentions, but none lead to the dignity she so carefully planned for. She doesn't fear death. What she fears is being kept alive as a shadow of herself, in a body sustained by systems that see food not as a choice, but as obligation. And perhaps that's the question we must all confront. Is feeding always kindness, or can it, in some moments, in some lives, become something more complicated, more fraught, and more deeply personal than we've ever been taught to believe? The experts are divided. In the face of Susan's quiet defiance, her unwavering belief in self-determination, the medical world stood uncertain, not because it lacked knowledge, but because it lacked agreement. And in that space between science and philosophy, compassion and compliance, her voice got lost. The debate among professionals is not just academic, it's deeply personal, because end-of-life care touches something primal in all of us, the tension between wanting to protect life and respecting when someone no longer wants it prolonged. Dr. James Wright, a medical director of multiple long-term care facilities in Virginia, stands firm in his belief feeding is non-negotiable. In his eyes, the act of offering food, even by hand, is a basic form of comfort care, no different than a warm blanket or gentle music in the final days. He points to patients who, years earlier, may have insisted they never wanted to live like that, only to find, in their fading years, moments of peace, even contentment. He calls those moments redemptive, proof that life, even in its most diminished state, still holds meaning. But for every patient who quietly adapts, there is another who lingers, eyes open but unseeing, body alive but unfeeling. And it is for these lives that Dr. Carl Steinberg raises his voice, a hospice physician with decades of bedside experience. Dr. Steinberg believes that autonomy doesn't expire when memory fades. If a patient like Susan made her wishes clear repeatedly, formally, and with witnesses then to override those choices, no matter how gentle the act, is to steal something sacred. He describes the act of hand feeding as deceptively intimate. It looks nurturing, he says, but if the person never wanted to be there, you're not saving them, you're trapping them. Then there's Dr. Barak Gaster, who created one of the most widely used dementia directives in the country. He sees the divide not as a medical failure, but as a cultural one. We haven't built systems that understand how people want to die. He explains, we've built systems that delay death at any cost often. The cost is dignity. And in that rift between interpretation and implementation, residents like Susan find themselves suspended. There's no courtroom to appeal to, no ethics board who guarantees a ruling, only letters from lawyers, vague policies, and staff caught between doing what's legal and doing what's right. The experts don't agree, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part, because when the professionals can't decide whether your choice should be honored, the system chooses safety, and safety, in this context, often means life, no matter the cost. For Susan, that ambiguity is unbearable, not just because she's afraid of being forgotten, but because she's afraid that in her most silent, vulnerable moment, when she can no longer resist or explain, she will be loved too much and heard too little. Stories like Susan's, but with a twist. Susan's story is not an outlier. It is a quiet echo of something larger, a slow-moving truth rippling beneath the surface of American elder care. For every Susan who speaks out, there are countless others whose final wishes remain trapped in filing cabinets acknowledged on paper, ignored in practice. In Oregon, there was a woman, let's call her Marie, who had once lived a vibrant life as a painter. She'd made it clear in her dementia directive if she no longer recognized her children, if she could no longer speak or eat by herself, she wanted to be allowed to go. And yet, in her final year, she was spoon-fed daily in a facility that labeled her directive unenforceable. Her children watched as she lingered, vacant and expressionless, kept alive by routine, not by will. Then there was Tom, a retired pilot from Washington. He'd flown planes through storms and lived with a philosophy of control of charting his own course. When he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 61, he sat down with his family and a lawyer. His directive was unambiguous: no feeding assistance if I can no longer communicate meaningfully. When the time came, his family fought hard. They pulled him out of the care facility when staff refused to honor his directive. They brought him home, enrolled him in hospice, and watched over him as he gently slipped away, just as he'd asked. 2 stories, same diagnosis, same type of document, 2 very different endings. And this is where the system fails, not in medicine, but in moral consistency. Why does one facility comply while another resists? Why can one family carry out a loved one's wishes while another is forced to watch those wishes be erased? The answer lies not in law, but in culture, in how we, as a society, view aging, dying, and the delicate balance between care and control. We are a country that fears letting go. We valorize endurance. We medicalize every ending. And so, when someone like Susan dares to say, "I want a different path," the system stutters. It doesn't know how to make space for a death that looks like surrender, even if it's rooted in strength. These stories matter, not because they shock, but because they quietly challenge our assumptions. They ask, what does it mean to honor someone's life? Really honor it if we don't also honor how they choose to leave. Susan reads about these cases. She studies them not with fear, but with solidarity. In Tom's family, she sees courage. In Marie's, heartbreak. She knows she could be either, and so she waits and prepares and prays that when her moment comes, the people around her will choose respect over reflex, listening over liability. Because in the end, no one escapes the question, when memory fades and words are gone, who speaks for us? How to prepare your own documents the right way. Susan's story and the stories of those like her carry a quiet urgency, not just for those already facing dementia, but for all of us who value choice, clarity, and dignity. Because the truth is, the best time to make these decisions is before you ever need them. But where do you begin first? You begin with courage. It takes bravery to look ahead and ask, what would I want if I could no longer speak for myself? Most people avoid the question until it's too late, but not you. You're here, now, listening, and that matters. Start by learning about advanced directives, not just the standard forms, but those specifically crafted for dementia. One of the most widely respected is Dr. Barak Gaster's Dementia Directive, a clear, compassionate tool that walks you through stages of cognitive decline and lets you express your preferences at each step. Another comes from End of Life Choices, New York, designed with the same purpose to protect your future voice. But don't stop at printing a form. Talk with your family, with your physician, with a lawyer if you can. Let them know what matters to you. Autonomy, dignity, the kind of life you'd still want to live and the kind you wouldn't. Be specific. General phrases like no extraordinary measures are often misunderstood. Instead, say, if I no longer recognize loved ones and cannot communicate meaningfully, I do not want to be hand-fed or hydrated. Clarity is kindness, not just for you, but for those who will one day have to speak on your behalf. Choose a healthcare proxy. You trust someone who won't waver, even when it's hard. Someone who understands that honoring your wishes isn't cruelty, but love in its purest, most selfless form. Understand that laws vary by state. For example, Nevada is currently the only state that explicitly recognizes dementia directives involving voluntarily stopping eating and drinking VSED. In most places, your directive can guide your care, but enforcement may depend on the facility's policies. So, ask questions before you commit. Get their policies in writing. Store your documents somewhere accessible. Make copies. Share them with your proxy, your doctor, your attorney, even your close friends. The more people who know your wishes, the harder they are to ignore. But above all, don't wait, because preparing for death isn't about giving up. It's about living better today, knowing you've already protected your tomorrow. It's about writing a final chapter you can be proud of, one grounded in choice, not fear. Susan once said, "I'm not afraid to die. I'm afraid to be kept alive in a way that makes me disappear." So let her story remind you, your voice is strongest while you still have it. Use it, write it down, speak it out loud, and give your future self the most sacred gift of all, the right to be remembered as you truly are. What the law says and why it's not enough. When Susan received the letter from Kendall's legal team, the one that told her, in careful, clinical language, that her dementia directive would not be honored, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat in silence, a silence heavier than any diagnosis, because this time, it wasn't her brain that was failing. It was the very system meant to protect her. She had done everything right, drafted her directive, named a healthcare proxy, followed the legal procedures. She had played by the rules. But now, she was learning a truth that too few people ever realize until it's too late in America. When it comes to dying, the law is rarely on your side. Federal regulations, particularly those governing Medicare certified facilities, require care homes to provide residents with daily meals and assistance with feeding. These mandates are written with compassion in mind, meant to prevent neglect, to ensure no one is left hungry or forgotten. But what happens when feeding is no longer nourishment, but a violation? What if the resident has already said, "I don't want this, not if I can no longer be myself"? That's where the law stumbles, not out of cruelty, but out of rigidity. State laws vary, often dramatically. Only Nevada, as of now, has explicitly acknowledged the legal right to pre-authorize the refusal of food and water through a dementia directive. In other states, including New York, the legal terrain is murky. Some interpret hand-feeding as basic care that must be offered. Others see it as a medical intervention that should require consent. That lack of clarity creates a dangerous vacuum, one where facilities default to self-protection, not resident empowerment, where caregivers, afraid of liability, ignore the clearly written wishes of someone who once had full capacity and begged to be heard. Susan isn't alone in this legal limbo. Across the country, families find themselves fighting not just disease, but policies, not just heartbreak, but paperwork. Their loved ones become battlegrounds between ethics and liability. And the system's response: silence, indifference, or if was polite deflection hidden behind regulatory jargon. What the law offers now is a shell of protection, not its substance. It claims to respect autonomy, but fails to enforce it when it matters most, when memory fades, and the voice can no longer speak. This isn't just a legal issue, it's a moral one. Until we build laws that recognize cognitive decline as a medical condition with legal foresight, not despite it, people like Susan will continue to write their wishes in ink, only to see them erased by institutions too afraid to honor them. We can do better, and we must, because if dignity is a right, then so is the freedom to decide when it ends and how. A call to action for all of us. Susan's story is not just a warning. It is a mirror held up to a society that talks endlessly about choice, yet falters when those choices challenge comfort, routine, or risk. It's easy to see this as someone else's problem. A story from a quiet retirement community in upstate New York, a legal dispute wrapped in medical ethics. But that's the illusion, because if you live long enough, this story might one day be yours or your parents', your partner's, your friends'. Dementia is not rare. It is rising. It is the quiet pandemic of aging. And yet, for all our progress in medicine and technology, we still haven't figured out how to let people go with grace when they're ready and when they've already told us how. So what do? We start by talking with our families, our doctors, our communities. We normalize the conversations we've spent too long avoiding about death, about suffering, about what a good life means and what a good death should look like. We prepare not just with documents, but with dialogue. We make our wishes clear, and we make sure the people around us understand not just what we want, but why we want it. Clarity isn't just paperwork, it's legacy. We demand more from our care systems. Ask questions before signing contracts. Push for written policies. Advocate for transparency. Facilities that promise care for life must be held accountable to what that care truly means, not just physically, but ethically. We support legislation that catches up with reality. It's time our laws reflect the world we live in, a world where cognitive decline is common, where people lose their voices, but should never lose their rights. We push for more states to follow Nevada's lead. We speak up for federal clarity. We write to our representatives, not in anger, but in insistence, because no one should have to fight for dignity at the very moment they're least able to fight. And most of all, we remember people like Susan, not just as patients, but as pioneers, women and men who had the courage to look ahead, to speak up, to leave behind a blueprint for how we could do better. Let us not waste their courage. Let us not keep pretending that silence is safer than honesty. Let us not be a country that respects choice only when it's easy, but shrinks away when that choice is quiet, personal, inconvenient. Susan's voice may one day fall silent, but if we're listening, really listening, her message doesn't end here. It begins with us, a message for the future, you. One day, you may find yourself standing in front of a mirror and not recognizing the face staring back. Or worse, someone you love may be sitting in a chair, eyes vacant, hands trembling, and you'll wonder, are they still in there? Would they want this? Am I doing the right thing? And maybe you'll remember this story. Susan's story isn't one of defeat. It's one of clarity, of a woman who saw what was coming and chose, with steady hands and an open heart, to leave behind instructions for a death that matched the life she'd lived, one of intention, of peace, of presence. She didn't wait for the disease to define her. She spoke while she could. She made the hard decisions early so the future wouldn't have to guess. And now, that lesson belongs to you, because all of this is not just about end-of-life documents or medical ethics. It's about ownership of your body, your voice, your final breath. It's about leaving behind a map that tells the people you love, I've thought about this. I've prepared. Please honor what I believed in. That's not selfish. That's love. So here's what the future you, the quieter, slower, more vulnerable version of you needs from the person you are today. Write it down, speak it out loud, sign it, share it. Don't just whisper your wishes, declare them, because if you wait until you can no longer speak, it may be too late. And if you leave it unsaid, someone else will speak for you, a doctor, a nurse, a policy, or a fear, and they may not know what you valued. They may not understand who you were, but you know what matters. You know what kind of goodbye you want. So give that gift to yourself and to the people who will one day stand at your bedside, holding your hand, searching your face for answers they hope you left behind. Give them clarity, give them permission, give them peace. Susan may never get the ending she dreamed of, but you still have time to shape yours. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful thing of all. If you found Susan's story meaningful, share it, talk about it. Let it be a spark for real conversation in your home, your community, your future. If this story touched your heart, feel free to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts and let us know how you or your loved ones are preparing for the journey ahead. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt and meaningful stories about dementia, dignity, and the power of choice. Your support helps us continue bringing these important conversations to light.